Is a death penalty a legitimate means of carrying out justice? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. I'll preface this conversation by laying out a couple of things at the beginning. First of all, in Canada, the death penalty is abolished, but in America, depending on what state you're in, you can still encounter it in the justice system. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because this topic has blown up due to America's recent uptick in executions. It's not like one day they woke up and decided we're going to kill these criminals or whatever. This was slated, it was scheduled, and the time came and it happened. There seem to be a couple of them occurring within this very short time frame, and it's caught the eye of the media and people alike. This commotion has revived the debate around the death penalty. Is it a legitimate means of carrying out justice or not? I want to put my biases on the table from the very beginning, and I will say I do agree with Canada's stance in terms of abolishing it. I do not think it's a legitimate means of carrying out justice. It's actually quite the opposite. It provides the opportunity to botch the justice system entirely, and it may be contradictory to the very fabric of justice depending on how you define it. Before we get into any heavy arguments though, I just want to begin by laying out what exactly it is. The death penalty occurs when you commit a heinous crime, and as a result you're put on death row and you are executed. Now, why does it exist? There seem to be two train of thoughts here. The first is that it's a deterrent. Something that will scare a lot of people from committing those heinous crimes because you don't want to die, I presume. And the secondary mechanism there is that it's a justice-esque response to a crime. If you do something like kill someone, you should die as well. Something akin to an eye for an eye. That's another line of rationale I've seen come out of this debate. I will say though as well, another consideration is the time period. And it's really a question of alternatives actually, what it comes down to. This point is illustrated clearly when you look at something like a community in 2000 BC. It's not like these communities have much alternatives. If someone in your tribe committed a crime, they were a maniac, they were killing people, what choice did you actually have as the chief, for example? Did you have a fully functioning jail system that could hold this individual and ensure they would commit no crimes in the future? The answer is no. Did you have proper rehabilitation programs? The answer is no. So what could you do? Well, you could banish them, kick them out of the tribe, but there is the risk of them simply returning and continuing to do their work, and perhaps now it's tinged with a layer of revenge on it. In a situation like that, it seems like the death penalty would be the only logical thing to resort to. And of course, I'm still not saying it's ethical or the right thing to do, but practically, as a community in 2000 BC, faced with the realities of a situation like that, I can see why the notion of the death penalty was held in that sort of pragmatic regard. Today, though, it's not the same equation, because we do have those alternatives. We're not a small tribe limited by our resources. We have fully staffed correctional facilities and jails and penitentiaries and places to put these people. In other words, we actually have a choice now. Before, not so much. Today, definitely, there is no argument there. You do have a choice, and when you have a choice, there is a sort of moral weight that's cast upon you. When you don't really have a reasonable recourse or another course of action to undergo, then you can't really be held to the same moral policy, the same moral standard. But when you can make a decision between two things, now it's cast upon you. The onus is on you to make the right decision. And I don't think the death penalty is the right one. When you have that conscious decision to be making, there is something beyond simply committing the murder, and it's actually the same justification that we cast upon something like manslaughter versus premeditated murder. The end result is still a dead person. You can have the death penalty in 2000 BC and it today, the result is still a dead person who committed the crime. But the intention there is very different. Manslaughter is something you could say accidental or beyond your control. In 2000 BC, you can make that case. Doing something like putting someone and sending them to the gallows in 2000 BC, when you didn't have much alternatives, you can say that was beyond the community's control. Today, though, it would be something more akin to that premeditated murder because we have a choice and we actually plan it out. We go through the entire trial, court process, the jury, and we take in all the facts of the case, we think about it, and at the end of that deliberation, we still say, kill this person. That's very different. Now I want to circle back to the point I made before, well, the 2 points I made, the first about deterrence and the second about justice itself. So, deterrence. Studies reveal that it's not really that much of a deterrence because there is a such thing as diminishing returns. So, let's say the penalty for robbing a bank is hypothetically 1 year. People would see that and say, well, if I only make $40,000 a year, but I stand to gain $60,000 by robbing the bank, and I only have to pay 1 year in prison, well, maybe it's a fair trade. That likely would not deter all the people you want deterred. But if you say it's 5 years, and that'll deter some more people, there'll still be some left in the population who are willing to commit the crime. Then you say it's going to be 10 years is less people now, 15, 20, 30, whatever, all the way up to life in prison. And at that point, you're left with a pretty hardened crew. People who are still willing to subject themselves to a life of, what would you call it, confinement, to carry out the crime. That tells you something about the individual. Now, if you say, hey, we're going to go one level up, from life imprisonment to the death penalty, how many more of those people do you think are going to be scared off? If you are already willing to be detained for the rest of your life, would you dying really change your mind? It seems to me the individual who is making that trade-off there is not going to be swayed anymore. That next level is not really a consideration to them because they've thrown their life away already by making the decision to commit a crime at the level where they would be spending the rest of their life in prison. And you can also look at stats to verify this claim. So look at a county or a state like perhaps Texas, where I do believe the death penalty is still in effect, and compare the rates of homicide, compare the rates of bank robberies, whatever you want to choose, to a location where there is not the death penalty, where the maximum charge is life imprisonment, perhaps to any province in Canada, really, British Columbia, Ontario, Alberta, whatever you want. There is no major discrepancy between the two. It's not like Texas with their death penalty has no crime now because people are very afraid of committing those heinous offenses on a per capita basis, and it does not look like the death penalty is influencing any of these hardened criminals' minds at all. So, what really is the point of it then? A life imprisonment charge seems to be the net that's cast as wide as possible that's going to be catching as many of these criminals as possible when it comes to deterrence. Anything beyond that's not deterring these a little bit more deranged individuals. And I'm not taking away from the fact that there are very heinous crimes that can be committed. And that's going to segue us into the next point. The idea of it being a justice mechanism. That people can commit such heinous crimes that the only logical response that we can do, or we can have, is to execute them. I understand where that's coming from. If someone were to, there's no shortage of possible crimes you can list here, and I don't want to get too deep into it. I will admit that some of these things that people can do will very likely lead you to that end, where you hear about the story and you think that person should be killed right away. But is that really true justice here? Have you actually done anything to remedy the situation, to help the individual who has been killed? The answer really is no. The remedy truly is to remove the person who committed the crime, the perpetrator, from society so they cannot do the same thing again. And they can be removed, as I said, either through killing them or locking them up. There is a choice here. And I'm sure as well, depending on how you feel about certain crimes, you may say, for this, we should kill them, for that, we shouldn't, because not everyone has the same opinion. You may be of the mind that someone who commits rape should be executed, but someone else might not. But they might say someone who commits murder should be executed, and you might not think so. Really, there's a moral dilemma even there. In simply getting our definitions straight and agreeing on what we think should and should not be included in this bag of execution, we don't have these same basis points, and that leads me to the next point, which is that historically people have been killed and executed by the state for various reasons, and of course our ethics and morals advance over time. But not so long ago, you could be executed for taking a loaf of bread from a merchant on the street in certain places in the world. Do we think that's a legitimate way of responding to the situation, where someone who is perhaps poor and starving, needs to find food for their family, and they've taken the bread that is worth maybe 10 cents, and now they're going to die for that? Well, prior societies would give that same defense mechanism, saying it's a part of justice. They've committed a crime that we deem so intolerable by our societal standards that there's nothing else for us to do but kill the individual. And that's one of the issues there. Because as you may or may not have heard, Iran recently, this country is mixed up in a lot of crazy things. They executed a journalist last week. Now why? Because the individual was critiquing the government. And to them, they're saying, hey, based on our societal standards, like how you are going to execute whoever you're going to execute, because they did a drive-by, they did that and that, whatever, we're holding this crime, based on our definition, on that same pedestal. And we're going to execute this journalist over here because we don't like what they said. Now, that poses a very interesting dilemma because, as you can see, it casts a shadow of doubt on our very critiques of Iran now, because I feel the average American, the average Canadian would say Iran is psycho for doing that. For executing a journalist because they chose to write an unfavorable piece about the government. That's pure narcissism. That's insanity. That's dictatorial from the state perspective, but they can very clearly say, based on our standards of a society, we deem it correct, and you do the exact same thing. You as a society figure out what's acceptable and what's not, and therefore, what you're doing is very similar to what we're doing here. And of course, that's a moral relativist argument, and I'm no fan of that. But it might hold some water because I don't think America is much better for executing an individual who committed a crime when he was 18, and he very clearly seems to have grown from it. He's more mature now. I think he's ready to turn his life around, but instead of giving him that chance, we're executing him. Iran, of course, with a more radical example, killing a journalist because they don't like what they wrote, but still, fundamentally, the same essence there. It's based on the standards of society, and let's say hypothetically too, one day Iran advances past this level of theocracy, a government ruled by these notions here. One day they may realize that what they did to that journalist is a terrible mistake. We should not be punishing the press for writing whatever they want to write about. If they come to that point, maybe in 20, 30 years, it will be too late to reverse a decision. If they simply put that person in jail, of course it's terrible, but there is the chance that he is released now because they see the errors of their way. If you execute the person though, regardless of how much you change in the future, how much more open or developed or modern you become in your thinking, there is nothing you can do to remedy the situation anymore. It's over. It's a wrap. There's no going back. It's a very final choice you're making by doing that. And of course, I must say as well that this is not me trying to put out an argument laying out that there aren't things that people do that appear to be worthy of death, and at the same time, there's varying degrees. Of course, what Iran is doing is on a different level than America. But fundamentally, though, there is a similarity there. And I don't think any country in North America wants to be in the same bucket as Iran when it comes to justice. Because as you know, there clearly is very little semblance of justice in what Iran is doing. But that same thread, it extends to America still. Because they allow the death penalty based on societal definitions of what is acceptable and what's not. And you can look at America even 100 years ago, 200 years ago. People were being executed by the state for things that we would not deem acceptable today. And I'm pretty sure in 100 years, it's going to be the same case. People were being executed for things that the people of the future would deem not acceptable. It's a moral smearing. Because, once again, there is no way to return. If you jail that person, though, you change your mind. Of course, they've lost those years. It's tragedy. It's terrible. But the situation can be amended to some degree. They can be set free. They can enjoy the rest of their life. But once they're gone, they're gone. So that's the trouble with this approach. Now, let's say you are not swayed by what I've laid out. It begs the next question, which is, what is your perceived goal of the justice system? Is it actually revenge/retribution based? Because if that's your definition, then it makes sense. If someone kills someone, then they should die as well. If someone robs this person, they should be robbed as well. The eye for an eye. If that's your model, then I can see why you'd be attracted to the idea of capital punishment. But if it's not your model, what is then? Some would say, really, functionally, there are two things here. The first is to ensure the individual cannot repeat the crimes they committed and harm other members of society. And as we laid out, there's two paths there. The first is you kill them. They won't do anything anymore. The second is you put them in jail. They still will not be doing anything because they are confined now. But once you get beyond that, it's the second consideration. If you put them into jail, what can we do with that? Would it not be beneficial to try and institute some mechanism of change, of reformation, of helping the individual perhaps get better? Because it's possible. Some people commit crimes when they're very young and they age 20 years in jail. If you spend those 20 years actually developing them, trying to assist them, there is a percentage of those people who will get better. Not all of them, of course. I'm not saying to do this blanket policy where we're very nice to every criminal and we trust 100% that each and every one of them will be better and reformed after their sentence. That's folly. It's just confusion. But some of them will. And more of them can if we permit and allow for the proper resources to be in place. And I think that's better for everyone. And analysis would have to be done on a case-by-case basis to check the individual to see how they're progressing and to see if they're actually showing signs of change and repentance and whatnot. And if they are, I would assume once they are released, when they've been properly treated and helped, the percentage of people after that point who fall back to committing crimes would be far lower than if you didn't do anything. If you put them in their cell, let that ferment, let them continue to be angry and think about their level of vengeance now. When you put them back into society, it may not be the best outcome. And it is true as well that many people commit crimes because of their economic status, socioeconomic, you could say. If there is no way for an individual, well, let's start over actually. Let's say that someone feels like they have no other way to make a living other than selling drugs or robbing banks, or not even robbing banks, robbing other people, committing crime. And they go to jail because of that. Now when they come out of jail, they realize that they have no employment opportunity because, as you can see, not many people want to hire a convict. So where are they? Back in the same place that they began actually, and will they do something different this time? Probably not. They might feel that's the only path because they haven't been shown any other way. So, they're free, they go back to a life of crime, back in jail. What if, though, we had a way to assist that, to help them find another way to live? That would be very impactful. The same goes for behavior, too. The individual may have known one way of violent living prior to going to jail. Now they're here. If we have a program and resources and ways for them to improve when they come out, they might choose a different path. But if they are not shown another alternative, if they don't know one, it's unlikely they'll do that change. There are arguments here in terms of a taxpayer perspective where it's actually probably cheaper for you to get these guys the resources they need right away and to help them not recommit crimes when they are released because you're paying less in jail fees and expenses that come out of your taxes and whatnot. There's also the humanitarian argument where people should be given at least a chance to do better. They're clearly in a fallen state because of the crimes they have committed, but it doesn't mean that they have no hope. Of course, there's probably some people who you'd be tempted to say have no hope, whether that's their own doing or a psychological issue or whatever, but that's not true for everyone. And they should all at least be given that chance, and we do have these standards in place, something like innocent until proven guilty. Something like that protects even criminals because that's how we operate and develop society. We try to be fair. We try to be logical. We try to weigh our options here. I do think in addition to that, innocent until proven guilty, there should be something that even if guilty, you should be given a chance to improve. And if you don't do that, if you don't show a commitment to it, then we have no choice but to keep you locked up. I am not someone who advocates for the abolishment of prison or the police or anything like that. But the death penalty, I will say, I do think abolish the death penalty is a good idea. If you do think that there should be aspects of reformation and giving people the chance to develop and grow and change, well, that's contrary to what the death penalty and capital punishment do. They're not compatible. Capital punishment offers no semblance of the possibility of change because the person is dead. And let's say they do change. They are given the capital punishment sentence when they're, 18. It's not instantaneous. They're not being taken out back the next day and killed. It takes many years. And let's say the individual actually does change in those years and we can all see it. We all know it's very clear. What do? The sentence has already been handed down. It's rigid. That person can become a saint for all we care. And they're still going to die now. The way this operates does not seem like justice to me. As well, everything I've said so far is based on the premise that we do everything correctly, that we operate based on the truth and we convict people accurately. We know that's not true though. Capital punishment presumes that we have the authority to make 100% correct judgments all the time. But history shows that wrongly convicted people do pop up here and there, and they have been executed before. There is no opportunity to correct for that. If you take the wrong individual, because courts and trials, although good, are not perfect, and you take an individual who was wrongly blamed for something, and we killed them, then it turns out down the line that we realized it was a mistake, and this has actually happened before. What does that say about your system? And this is the contradiction here. So you've killed the individual for doing whatever, murder, rape, whatever. The system itself has now killed an innocent individual. How do we react to the system? Based on that same standard here of retribution-based justice, we should be killing the system now. Because you killed someone who didn't deserve to die, now you may deserve to die as well for that, using that line of thinking. It's a contradiction. I really do feel that, given the realities of human error and the fact that we're relying on juries who may or may not be biased or partial or all of these things here, that resorting to capital punishment is a mistake virtually all the time. Because these people are still innocent until proven guilty, and if they are proven guilty, there's still a chance that they aren't. And if we lock them up, and we realize 20 years later that it was a mistake, we can still try and make things better. We can set them free. Of course, they'll sue you now, rightfully, and you'll pay them out. Try to make the remaining years of their life as amazing as possible, given the damage and the horror that the state has inflicted upon it. But if that person is killed, there is no way of working out of that. The individual is dead. And where is the justice in that? If you wrongly convict someone, it's a mistake, of course. They can be set free, they can be made whole, perhaps through monetary arrangements and whatever. That's all fine. Of course, it's still heinous. Massive loss has been transpiring here because of the faults of whatever happened in the case and whatnot. But you can still make it better. There's still that potential there. When the person is gone, though, they've been executed, there's no way of going back. I've yet to encounter truly a strong argument for the death penalty, given the fact that we have alternatives today. Given the fact that I think people should be granted the opportunity to change, that I think the justice system should have rehabilitation pieces into it, based on the fact that there have been times where we've executed the wrong people, based on the fact that governments like Iran are doing virtually the same thing. Capital punishment for things that they deem societally unacceptable. You don't want to be in that same bucket as the likes of Iran, China, North Korea. Countries that freely commit capital punishment, and they're saying the same thing. Hey, it's based on our standard. China is different than Iran, different than North Korea, different than America. All different reasons for killing people, but they're still killing their citizens based on a quote-unquote crime, which changes based on where you are. The definition of that's fluid. You don't want to be in that same category. I would advise America to drop out of that, end this insanity, and look at your alternatives because they do exist. And of course, I'm open to hearing the other side of the argument. I have done my research into it, but it's just not that convincing. I see no reason why we still continue, or not we as in Canada, but we as in North America, still have instances of this occurring, other than the fact that we don't want to change tradition. Just because it's been happening, just because it's a part of history, just because it's part of the current system does not mean that it is correct, and we have to be open to that debate. Now, usually I'm a critic of these one-line slogans, abolish the police, abolish that, whatever, whatever. I like nuance and I like debating, but I will say the slogan, abolish the death penalty, that one I think makes sense. And, we'll see how things go. I do think America will accomplish that. I think a lot of people are on the same train of thought as what I've laid out here. And I do think that will be a step in a positive direction. Now, with that, that brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. They'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.